Water bills skyrocketing across the district by hundreds of dollars a month. And it's not about a leak. It's a multi-billion-dollar project, and D.C. Water is making you pay for it.
Now, we understand their dilemma,
right,
but it's hard. It's really hard on us.
So customers reached out to the News 4i team, and our team started digging into whether some of these people are being charged unfairly.
Yeah, investigative reporter Jody Fleischer is here now with what she uncovered. Jody?
Well, we first heard about this from a local pastor who says his church can't afford its growing water bills. They're using the same amount of water, but their bills have jumped from $150 a month to $900 a month. We found the faith community, which survives largely on your donations, has shelled out millions just for these fees.
On Sunday mornings at the First Baptist Church on Minnesota Avenue, the members celebrate a higher power. But it's the church's higher water bills that have Velma Wyman on edge.
It's dire. It's dire because we're looking at our budget now for 2018 and we can't balance it.
The members pass the plate, but now many of their donations can't go to the ministry or the long list of needed projects for the 144-year-old congregation.
Our people are very generous and they will do that. But at a certain point, they don't have the money.
Down the road at Bethesda New Life Gospel, Pastor Jesse Richardson is also getting hit.
And we started to notice this great big old water bill all of a sudden.
He says at first when he called DC Water, they said he must have had a leak.
They came by and they checked all the plumbing, and one of the deacons happened to look at the itemized bill and say, hey, wait, what is this?
It's called the Clean Rivers Impervious Area Charge, or IAC, and it's listed on every DC water bill to pay for the building of large underground tunnels to keep sewage and stormwater from flooding our rivers. But when the News 4i team was flooded with complaints from across the district, we took a look at the numbers.
They gave absolutely no thought to how the process or how much they would charge. And I just think it's totally unfair.
DC Water does have a formula. The News 4i team found it's based on pictures taken from the air of every Washington, D.C. property. Those photos are used to calculate the square footage of the buildings and any areas of concrete like sidewalks or parking lots. The thinking is the properties with the most concrete would contribute the most stormwater runoff and should pay more.
Some churches in our least affluent communities are paying the most, like close to $50,000 in a Ward 8 church. How does that even make sense?
The Archdiocese of Washington says its member churches are at a breaking point. The same is true for synagogues and mosques, where the main source of income is donations. And congregants who live in the district are also paying the fee on their own water bills at home.
So it's not fair. Some people are paying it twice or 3 times if they happen to own a business.
For months, the News 4i team filed records requests and crunched the numbers. We found the district's faith-based community has already paid more than $11 million just in Clean Rivers fees. When the charge first started in 2009, it was so small no one really noticed. Now, some churches pay $6,000, $9,000, even $12,000 a month just for that fee.
It makes me feel that we're being almost robbed or extorted for money. We have to remember, we cannot charge people to come into the church.
So we took their concerns to the head of DC Water, George Hawkins.
It pains me to explain this to our ratepayers, but it is the hard reality. We have a giant project. It's the biggest public works project in Washington, D.C. since Metro was built.
He says one benefit of the current system is it allows DC Water to collect from properties that are only parking lots with plenty of stormwater runoff and no need for regular water service. But he knows the faith community and other nonprofits are hurting.
It is definitely something of great concern.
What do you say to those ratepayers who are small and have no way to raise that money?
One of the challenges we have in the district, perhaps more than most cities, is an enormous number of our customers are nonprofit. Government is nonprofit.
And some nonprofits have no trouble paying the higher bills, so the board would have to consider how to help the ones who can't pay while making sure the ones who can don't get an unnecessary break.
Every discount we give to one customer is money we have to raise from everybody else.
Which means regular homeowners, local business owners, even the government-owned buildings whose bills are paid with your tax dollars will all make up the difference.
We look at every option, and there aren't that many, unfortunately. Someone's got to pay the bill.
You all say amen? Amen.
At Velma's church, members have tried everything they can think of.
If we get a heavy rain, it looks like a little river coming through.
In 2013, D.C.'s Department of Environment and the Anacostia Watershed Society helped build the church 2 rain gardens and funnel water from their roof. They also replaced a large section of concrete with porous pavers to limit their runoff. The whopping credit on the church's bill, $2.45 off that $420 fee.
Oh yeah, you feel good, but your purse doesn't feel good because it's costly.
And the I-Team found DC Water actually increased the church's fee instead of lowering it. She says churches could be forced to cut feeding programs, book bag giveaways, even holiday help for the needy.
It's hard. It's really hard on us.
The federal government mandated that DC Water fix this environmental problem, but critics wonder whether the agency had to build a $3 billion project to do that. Now, the head of DC Water told me the board will thoroughly evaluate whether it can afford to create a hardship exemption for nonprofits like churches, but that probably won't even get considered until sometime next year. The head of DC Water did tell me he understands there's a problem here and vowed the board will eventually look at it. In the meantime, some of DC's most prominent cemeteries are buried in bills and have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on that fee.
When you look out across the rolling hills of Rock Creek Cemetery, you find a resting place filled with beauty, sculptures, and a significant piece of Washington, D.C. history.
We have 4 Supreme Court justices here. We have a signer of the Constitution here.
Over the years, these grounds have attracted people of all faiths, races, and backgrounds. The 86 acres also serve as a public park.
This is the most historic cemetery in the city, and we want to be here. We've been here since 1712.
But Jim Jones says the cemetery's future is in jeopardy because it can't pay its $200,000 a year water bill, a bill that used to cost about $3,500.
Our actual water usage is declining, but the actual water bill is still climbing.
That's because of this little line right here, the Clean Rivers IAC, which stands for Impervious Area Charge. DC Water's fee for anything on your property that water runs off of, be it a roadway, parking spaces, or the roof of a building. And in the cemetery's case, even all of these little buildings.
It was a real shock and a surprise. Most of these mausoleums were constructed as places for people's loved ones 150, 200 years ago. There's no way that we go back and recapture that.
The News 4i team spent months requesting records from DC Water, matching up properties and calculating how much each has to pay. DC cemeteries have already paid millions, funding the district's multi-billion-dollar tunnel project to keep sewage and stormwater from flooding our rivers.
It just seems patently unfair that the heaviest burden appears to be in a place that is actually supporting the city in its work to serve the community.
The Archdiocese of Washington says cemeteries and churches are especially hard hit because they have to have parking areas. Some larger cemeteries also have roads to get to their grave sites. It all factors into that fee. But the I-Team found DC Water doesn't make the district pay for its roadways. Those are exempt.
If it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander.
DC government does pay millions each year for its buildings and parking lots, and so does the federal government. The fee even allows DC Water to charge customers who don't get a regular water bill, but do cause lots of stormwater runoff, like commercial parking lots. Jones says cemeteries are different.
We're not the commercial parking lot or the evil chemical company incorporated. We're a green space.
He says the cemetery even spent $100,000 ripping out some of its roadways and planting grass instead. But when it appealed to DC Water, an inspector came out and noticed more impervious area, so the fees went up.
We were absolutely dumbfounded. We have the largest variety of trees outside of the Arboretum here in Washington, D.C.
Speaking of the National Arboretum, that 400-acre sanctuary of public green space pays nearly $400,000 a year in IAC fees, even though it isn't hooked to a storm drain and reuses its stormwater runoff to water the plants.
So they feel like they shouldn't have to pay the IAC charge. I mean, do you feel like that's a valid argument?
It's an argument that has a point to it.
The head of DC Water says if the bills are lowered for cemeteries and the Arboretum, the rest of the city's customers would have to make up the difference because that massive tunnel project isn't getting any cheaper.
We're going to evaluate various options of what we could or should do. Just on this basis, what is the cost of it?
Some cities like Baltimore have already exempted cemetery streets from stormwater fees and offer a hardship exemption for nonprofits who can't pay. Jones says the cemeteries won't be able to pay anything if they're all out of business.
I think over time, many operators are going to be simply left with no other choice than to close their gates and walk away. And I think for an institution like Rock Creek Cemetery, that is just unthinkable.
Several board members say they recognize there's an issue here. They just aren't sure exactly how to address it, but they have vowed to do something. They will discuss it in detail at their next rate meeting later this month.
For months, the I-Team has been investigating complaints about the Clean Rivers program and the fee to pay for it. It's on every water bill in the district, and it grows every year. Property owners pay based on the square footage of their buildings, sidewalks, and parking areas, which can increase stormwater runoff. Some customers say the fees have gotten so high they can't pay their bills. For the first time, the water board chairman addressed that.
The board from the DC water side has to look at, have we created an unfair burden for any particular entity, and we're going to have to make some adjustments.
The fees are paying for a $2.6 billion tunnel project to stop sewage from overflowing into our rivers. Today, the general manager addressed the I-Team's reporting on the fees and the impact on water customers.
I am certain that this is a challenge and that we have customers that have raised points that are worthy of consideration. I think you've seen the reporting. Like I said, I think it's been good journalism. Tough. I've been me on those shows. I've had a lot of people talking to me about it.
And you'll hear from even more of those folks coming up tomorrow on News 4 at 6. Our investigation continues with a look at how some homeowners are trying to fight these growing bills. And we'll introduce you to one woman who warned years ago that D.C. residents were not going to be able to handle these growing fees.
As the rain pours down, the water piles up, running off of parking lots and sidewalks, filling the district's storm drains and sewers. But not from this property, says Chandra Hardy.
This part flows down directly into that green area over there.
The retiree also showed the News 4 I-Team how the water from her downspouts is redirected into drains that connect to her septic system. Her home doesn't get a sewer bill because she doesn't use the sewers, but her water bill is still nearly $400 a month.
It's just quite a lot of money.
And nearly 90% of that bill comes from one fee. It's called the Clean Rivers IAC, and it's supposed to charge for the stormwater runoff your property creates, based on the square footage of your rooftops, roadways, and parking areas that do not absorb water.
They're charging a fee, and they're perfectly right to do that if you're overburdening the system.
But Chandra says she isn't. This letter from an engineering review clearly says her property is not connected to the D.C. sewer system or the city storm drains. But she says D.C. Water ignored that argument when she took her case to a hearing officer last year. And she lost, even though the agency's own website says the fee is based on a property's contribution of rainwater to the district's sewer system.
It is a ridiculous burden on an issue which is quite clear.
Todd Boley had the same thought when the ball was in his court. This is his backyard, with the weeds growing up through the porous surface.
This court requires water on it to be playable.
He too has an engineering report and letter from the company that manufactures the court.
It was more permeable than normal backyard grass.
But the same D.C. Water hearing officer who ruled against Chandra ruled against Todd too.
To get it fixed is pretty hopeless. I mean, it's very difficult.
So the News 4 I-Team requested the records and didn't find one customer who appealed their IAC fees and won.
DC Water says that tennis courts, by definition, are impermeable. So it doesn't matter if I show that it's permeable, because the hearing examiner can't change the rules.
DC Water did finally agree to settle and lower Todd's future bills, but not before he spent 2.5 years and thousands of dollars fighting.
Well, of course it seems silly, but you know, what can you do?
Carol O'Claricon says D.C. Water can do a lot, and she said it 5 years ago in this report for the Brookings Institution. She wrote that D.C. Water's customers will notice the impact since the fees increase exponentially every year.
I think you have to ask if this is sustainable. Can you keep going like this?
Well, and is it fair to the ratepayers?
Of course it's not fair.
She raised several possible concerns with the present IAC structure, noting that D.C. Water should explore whether the square footage alone is sufficiently related to runoff levels.
What kind of traction did it get?
Not a lot. I was kind of disappointed. But it's then it was maybe a nerdy issue. Now it's a pocketbook issue.
And a big one, a $2.6 billion tunnel project, Washington, D.C.'s answer to a federal mandate that it stop overflows of sewage and wastewater into our rivers.
We have to raise some serious questions about whether there's the capacity in the district to pay for this.
After the News 4i team exposed the impact the IAC fees are having, DC Water announced it would examine the fairness of the current rate structure. Some churches told us they'll have to cut community programs to afford water bills in the thousands. And the district's most historic cemetery says it could have to shut down.
Every discount we give to one customer is money we have to raise from everybody else. It's a painful reality for what is necessary to improve our system.
The head of DC Water says properties that are mainly green space, like cemeteries or the National Arboretum, might deserve a break. The Arboretum spends about $400,000 a year on IAC fees and is not hooked into the city storm drains, just like Chandra Hardy.
I just would like this issue ended because it's illogical.
Chandra Hardy has now taken her case against DC Water to the court system. She says she isn't backing down because it's a matter of principle. And you can bet the Arboretum is watching her case closely. So are some DC council members. They're planning to hold a hearing on the growing DC water bills in just a couple of weeks.
Cemeteries buried in water bills have new hope tonight. A D.C. councilman took action to lower those fees that have some cemeteries worried they might have to shut down.
The News 4i team first exposed this problem last month, you'll recall, and our investigative reporter Jody Fleischer has more now on the impact this new legislation could have.
This bill is designed to alleviate some of that financial hardship.
D.C. Councilman Brandon Todd represents Ward 4, home to Rock Creek Cemetery, the district's oldest, and the subject of a News 4i team investigation, which exposed how their water bill had grown to $200,000 a year, even though they were using less water.
4 Supreme Court justices are buried there, and there's so much history, and we would hate to see their doors closed. And so certainly it's incumbent upon us in the city to do what we can to help them.
Most of the bill is actually a DC Water fee called the Clean Rivers Impervious Area Charge. It's based on the square footage of the property that's made of concrete or other surfaces likely to increase stormwater runoff, like rooftops and sidewalks. Todd's proposal would exempt private roads and parking lots from the calculation that determines how much each customer has to pay.
This couldn't be a better beginning to what will undoubtedly be a long process. But we are very, very happy.
Jim Jones told the I-Team the cemetery's future was in jeopardy if something didn't change. Under Todd's proposal, the cemeteries would still pay part of the fee, but the bills would be significantly lower.
I expect that there will be a robust conversation from many different sides talking about how we move forward and what that looks like.
Following the I-Team reports last month, DC Water agreed to look at the fairness of how the fee is calculated for all customers. The Rates Committee will begin tackling that next week. The fees are paying for a $2.6 billion project to build large underground tunnels which will keep sewage and stormwater from flooding our rivers. Todd says there's no question it's needed.
And it does have to be paid for. We just have to figure out how we can lessen the burden on some of our institutions that simply cannot pay.
That project is funded primarily by water customers. Some homeowners and the faith community also told the I-Team they've been unfairly impacted, with bills jumping by hundreds of dollars a month. Jones says everyone wants to have clean water, and he's willing to contribute as long as there's equity and fairness.
We understand that they've got something, a project that they've got to bring to fruition, and we want to see them do it. We just like to be around when they finish.
We've heard from many of you since we started reporting on all of these issues. D.C. Council plans to hear from the public on this as well. That meeting is next Friday. But because D.C. Water is financially separate from D.C. government, it is unclear whether anything the council does would be binding. Jody Fleischer, News 4 I-Team.
New developments after a big I-Team series. Customers packed D.C. Council chambers today to talk about their skyrocketing water bills and growing fees that seem to have no end in sight. Investigative reporter Jody Fleischer is in our newsroom with why some say the fees aren't fair and how to fix that. Jody?
Well, Leon, that's the $2.6 billion question, how to fund a massive tunnel project. Right now, it's largely paid for by D.C. Water customers based on the surface area of their property that can't absorb water, like rooftops, patios, and walkways. But as we showed last month, D.C. public roadways are exempt from that fee, even though they create plenty of stormwater.
If you truly want to relieve the pressure, the district government itself owns more impervious surface area than anyone. Thousands of miles of roadways, sidewalks, and alleys.
Today, that former D.C. Water Board member and about 24 other people spoke to council members at a hearing on water rates. Several representatives from churches and cemeteries across the district said their bills have grown by hundreds, even thousands of dollars a month, and they can no longer afford to pay. They all understand the project to stop sewage and stormwater from flooding our rivers is necessary. Some residents just don't know how they'll pay their bills.
I can't stop this rate from increasing. There's nothing I can do. If I stop running the water, the bill would just keep going up.
We're not asking for an exemption, a free ride. We're perfectly willing to pay our fair share. We just want some equitable treatment for it.
The council is considering legislation to lessen the burden for cemeteries, and today they also talked about lowering the fees for churches and other nonprofits with hardships. But if that happens, other customers would have to make up the difference unless the district or federal government agrees to fund it. Now, taking away the exemption for D.C. roads could bring in an extra $35 million a year. And as of now, those fees are projected to keep going up every year through 2030 and remain in those bills indefinitely. Jody Fleischer, News 4 I-Team.
Can you tell the difference between this public road or this private one? How about this sidewalk or that one? When it rains, they all create stormwater runoff, but only those who own private roads and sidewalks have to pay for it.
That is unfair. That has to be fixed.
Rylan Harris lives in Dakota Crossing in Northeast and knew his homeowners association had to pay for things like plowing and potholes on their private roads and sidewalks. But this year, D.C. Water also billed the HOA $40,000 in fees, even though it has no water service.
I was flabbergasted.
The townhome owners already pay their own water bills, which include Clean Rivers fees for runoff from their rooftops and patios. The money is going toward a massive government tunnel project, but the News 4 I-Team found the government gets a break. Thousands of miles of public roads and sidewalks are exempt from those fees.
I think that if D.C. doesn't pay for their roads, then we shouldn't pay for ours.
At the Capitol Park condo complex in Southwest, Alan Holland says the Clean Rivers fees are nearly $8,000 a month.
This is painful.
And D.C. Water is expected to double that again by 2026.
We're all willing to pay our fair share, but the manner in which it's being done, it potentially could bankrupt us.
Many of his neighbors are retirees on a fixed income. They moved here long before that fee existed and even tried replacing a courtyard with grass and some of their sidewalks with porous pavers. Allen says the complex was engineered with green landscaping to lessen runoff.
You try to mitigate this and not have runoff, but that doesn't seem to matter. It's just we have a monetary goal to get to.
D.C. Water has embarked on a $2.6 billion program to build underground tunnels to stop the sewage from overflowing into our rivers. The homeowners argue water runoff from the district's public roads and sidewalks contributes more to that problem than they do.
Can you find a way to address that for those folks?
The only way is to broaden it, not to narrow it. If they have impervious surfaces and they're contributing to the runoff, they're responsible for that property.
After a series of News 4 I-Team reports this fall, D.C. Councilwoman Mary Che scheduled a public hearing on the growing fees for the Clean Rivers project. She's asked D.C. Water to see if some customers, like churches and cemeteries, are paying too much. Many of those are facing the same issues with private roads and parking lots.
We'll figure out some way maybe to make these adjustments, but in the end, it's a big bill and we have to pay it.
She worries if D.C. government starts paying for public roads and sidewalks through tax dollars, those homeowners will essentially be paying twice.
I think that's pretty unfair. You know, there should be some kind of fairness and equity.
And it isn't always the association that gets stuck with the bill. In the Spring Valley West neighborhood, it's individual homeowners like Frank DeChico.
We own the middle of the road all the way around, plus the sidewalks too.
Each house in his neighborhood has a piece of road divvied up in front of it. Would you give it up if you could?
Sure. I don't think it would affect the value of the house.
He pays $216 a month just in Clean Rivers fees. His neighbors have paid more than $700,000 since the program started.
Individual.
Allen's condo association has paid about half that, but with the fees growing exponentially every year, he says there's no way it can continue.
It will eventually put everyone out of business and you won't be able to pay it. You won't get anything from anyone if the place basically dissolves.
Now, we tried to get to the bottom of how that exemption for public roads and sidewalks came to exist. We looked at years of meeting minutes and questioned former board members. We couldn't find any evidence of the government asking for the exemption or any discussion of how much it would cost. Now, a consultant told DC Water some other cities did that, and it became part of the plan here as well. When we asked DC Water how much it was losing, no one could tell us. Then we asked DC Council. No answer there either. It appears no one studied the numbers before the city and federal governments got this mammoth exemption. Now we've obtained records from the district's Department of Energy and Environment and did the math ourselves. DC Water is missing out on about $84 million a year because of those exemptions. Now, those fees are part of the Clean Rivers program, which charges every customer based on the square footage of their property that's impervious, meaning it could add to the district's stormwater runoff problems. Now, a huge portion of those fees comes from private sidewalks, roadways, and parking areas. But back when DC Water created the fee a decade ago, it decided to exempt thousands of miles of public roads, sidewalks, and alleys from that calculation. That's really frustrating for neighbors whose streets and sidewalks are considered private. They're billed hundreds of dollars a month. Some homeowners associations pay tens of thousands each year, and that's painful.
At the end of the day, I think the pain level is important, but so is just transparency and oversight and residents being confident that people are looking out for them.
Now, several of the district's advisory neighborhood commissions have hosted forums, passed resolutions, and written letters to council members urging them to do something to make the fee structure more fair. Most homeowners pay about $300 a year. And there's already one piece of legislation pending to ease the burden on cemeteries, which we reported could close from the high fees. At least one other council member is now considering how to address this issue involving the public roads.